Howdy, my name is Gabriel Nambila, and this is my final presentation for remote sensing. So, during the semester, I had a chance to read some amazing article and learn more how remote sensing are used in different aspects in different country and for different purpose. And throughout this presentation, I will go over the three articles that I read and discuss a little bit more about it. The first article I read is Sustainable and Smart City Planning Using Spatial Data in Wallonia. The second one is Measuring the Quality of Life in the City of Indianapolis by the integration of remote sensing and census data. And the last one was Remote Sensing and GIS Application Architecture Design. So first, let's cover my literature review one. So for my literature review one, the article that I read was Sustainable and Smart City Planning Using Spatial Data in Wallonia. So for this use case, in the city of Wallonia, Belgium, they were using remote sensing for urban planning. So what they did is they used lidar sensor to capture data of of the city of Wallonia over multiple years, so they could simulate population distribution and land use change. So in this particular use case, they use the same tools over a long period of time to create a data set, and with this data set they're able to run a few analysis on it. So for example, they could determine when a building was built, how the population was moving around and evolving over time, how urban planning was changing in the city of Wallonia. And it was actually a really interesting article to read, because in this particular concept it was the same data set but over a long period of time, and so they were able to do things that were never done before. So for example, they could go back in time and compare the certain population density in one area in a particular date in the past to the present and see how it evolved, and they could like interpolate on where this population will grow in the future. So here, for example, in my figure one, we can see how they use a classification method for accuracy and illustration. And so on the figure one, we can see that on far left we have a remote sensor image, and then the three other image on the right are how they classify those different buildings. So the building in red, the images, the shapefile in red were building, the shapefile in blue were water, and in green was grass, and in gray was scrub. And so that was one of the use case they use for this particular analysis. But then when we shift to the picture on the right on figure 2, where they use LiDAR for metric use, we can see how they use LiDAR for intensity, building footprint, and slope. And so we can see that with that LiDAR, they're able to, on image F, they were able to outline the building, made them stand out compared to the rest. And it was a really interesting use case because from the picture on the right and the picture on the left, they're exactly the same database, but they were used for different use cases. And so here we have another use case, and in that particular use case, we can see how, compared to the previous one, they kind of interpolate to a bigger area and have like all those different classification about the area and land use in 2010. And even after that, we can see they even projected the land use by 2015, like I was mentioning, 2050, like I was mentioning before. So they use all the data that they gather over time to make an estimation of where the population or where the urban development is going to end up in the future. And on the picture on the right, we can see the degree of urbanization. And so in this particular case, again, they use all the data they gather over time to create a map of the 2010 urbanization, and then they create a projection for 2050 by interpolating all the data that they gather over time. And we can see at the bottom how did they do it. And so in conclusion, for this article, I thought that was really interesting how the same data set were used for different use cases, and how this data set in particular was ones that was built over time with the same tool. And so now that we cover article one, we're gonna go over literature review two. So for literature review two, the article that I read was measuring the quality of life in the city of Indianapolis by integrating remote sensing and census data. And so the use case for this paper was to use remote sensor data and census data and create a framework to combine them to create an index to create an index that would determine the quality of life in a particular area of Indianapolis. And so it was actually happening in Marin County in particular, and they wanted a way to aggregate all those different data to create an index. And so on the right, we can see the area of interest that we mentioned before, Marion County in Indianapolis. And on the right, we can see the framework that was used to build these lifestyle index, which I found really interesting because usually census and remote sensor images behave in two different realms, but in this particular use case, they try to bridge those two data sets to create this index of lifestyle. And so let's start. So we can see that it starts with the remote sensor data. So they use band 1 through band 5 and 7. And this band is for green vegetation and impervious surface fraction. And ETM plus band 6 for surface temperature. And once they aggregate all those data into they aggregate into a block group. And then for the census group, they bring a socio-economic variable, and then they integrate the aggregate block group and the socio-economic variable to create a factor analysis. And then they pick a particular factor that they want, and then they were able to pick a quality of life index and have the regression analysis. And so here is a graph on the correlation matrix between the variable, for example, which show how they kind of interact between one another and how they kind of affect one another. So, for example, in this particular use case, we can see that in the case of, for example, let's say population density and housing density have a positive correlation. But in the case of green vegetation and population density, they have a negative correlation. And they did the same thing with different variables such as um, impervious surface, temperature, medium household income, medium family income, capita income, percentage of family under poverty, median household, and even more. And once they were able to aggregate all those data, they were able to provide this quality of life index. But that was not it. When this quality of life index came out, it was not a number. But since we use remote sensor data, they were able to plot it on a map to see where this quality of life was high or low. And so on this image, we can see how it works and the different factor that they use. So if you look at figure 3, for example, the first factor score, like the score that they picked in particular, was the economic index. And we can see that the highest level of economic index is usually around downtown, which makes sense. And the rest is kind of a little bit spread around. So that's for this particular case. And for the second one, they pick the third factor, which was for the second one, the second factor score, they pick environmental index. And we can see that it's a little bit like higher around downtown. And as we go further from downtown, it gets a little lower. And then for the third factor index, they pick crowdness. So crowdness, so how dense is a particular area. And so once you take economic index, environmental index, and crowdness index, and you aggregate them to synthesize them. That's when we're able to create this quality of life index that we have in figure 6. And we can see that the people with the highest quality of life index tend to live near downtown, and the other ones are kind of spread a little bit more about it as you get away. So, in conclusion, what I like the most about this article is how they use two different data sets to kind of create this index to determine how the lifestyle population work, how good someone lifestyle can be. And the way they did that is something that kind of amazed me, because they took remote sensor data and census data and aggregate them together to create those beautiful map that kind of give us a visual representation of the quality of life index. And lastly, the third article that I read was remote sensing and GIS application architecture design of remote sensing and census data. And so, the way these article work is they is a little bit different compared to the previous article that I read. That they were not trying to understand a pattern of behavior or quality of life, but they were trying to determine which building needed to be removed or which building needed to be upgraded in the city in Azerbaijan. So, which was a kind of a different use case and what building to renovate. So, in this particular case, GIS was used as a tool for decision making by the government, which I found really interesting. And so, when we go over figure 1, we can see a sketch of the street in Baku with the transport net system. And when they had this transport net system, they determined like a particular area where they kind of wanted to do this analysis. And then after, they took a group of people that they sent on the ground to manually gather data, such as when a building was built, how old was it, who was living there, sewage, everything related to building and around it. And then on figure 2, they'll both that's this are area, but they kind of sketch it out with legend, so they can see the gas pipe, the high tension cable, the sewage, the road, and the telephone cable manhole, and the population. And so after reading this article in particular, GIS will use as a tool to determine which building would be the best to be renovated without affecting that much population and that much system that would build around it, which I found really interesting. It kind of showed like the multifaceted of GIS. And so, in this third picture, it kind of shows us where, like from a higher point of view, where these area all those analyses happen. And in conclusion, after running these analyses, it kind of really helped the local government in this city of Azerbaijan to make the decision making. And so, in conclusion, after reading my three articles, um, um, sustainable and smart city planning using spatial data in Wallonia, measuring the quality of life in the city of Indianapolis by integrating remote sensing and census data, and remote sensing in NGS application architectural design. Throughout this semester, I learned that remote sensing is such an amazing tool and has so many use cases, and that not only that by itself remote sensor data help with decision making, but by the way it can be integrated with already existing system is what making already existing. And the fact that remote sensor images, it's an accurate depiction of the real world, is what even make it a better tool to help make decision making, because it's not based on numbers or imagination, but it's based on fact. And once you add gather data or data that you found online or different kind of data set on top of that, it kind of help you make a better decision in your process or run like deeper analysis. Like for example, if we go back to article review 1, for example, we can see that because of GIS, they were able to make prediction of the future, like what the land use is going to be by 2050, or what the degree of urbanism is going to be by 2050. And even if you go into Article 3, like this framework in particular, how they integrate all those different data sets to build these quality of life index. And if we go back into literature review 3, how they use GIS as a tool to help them determine which building was better to be renovated and build or destroy for to build new buildings, show you how flexible um, and how polyvalent, multifaceted GIS is as a tool. And so, in conclusion, I will say I learned so much by reading those articles and throughout the class in general. And that was my literature review final for remote sensing by Gabriel Nambila. Thank you.